Somewhere in the 1st century, a man sat down and wrote the strangest document in the New Testament. Letters in the ancient world announced themselves. The sender gave his name at the top, the way the New Testament letters carrying Paul's name do it 13 times. This writer skipped all of it. No name, no greeting, no address. The document simply begins. And for nearly 2,000 years, nobody has been able to prove who wrote it. Here is what we do know. Whoever he was, he wrote some of the most polished Greek in the entire New Testament. And he was afraid. You can hear it in the structure. 5 times in this document, right in the middle of the highest theology ever put on paper, the writer stops his own argument and sounds an alarm. He does it once, then returns to his teaching. Then he does it again, louder, then again. 5 alarms, each one more severe than the last, aimed at a group of believers who had done nothing scandalous. They had not denied their faith. They had not walked away. Most of them were still showing up. That is what makes this document so unsettling. The writer saw a danger his own readers could not feel. Something moving so slowly that the people caught in it thought they were standing still. He gave that danger a name we still use: drifting. This is the story of those 5 alarms, what they were warning against, why each one rings louder than the one before it. And the question underneath all of them: how does a faith that survived persecution start dying of something quieter? Start with what the first readers would have noticed before they heard a single sentence. A conventional letter in the Greco-Roman world opened with a formula: sender first, recipient second, a word of greeting third. Open nearly anything else in the New Testament and the pattern holds. Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus, to the Church of God in Corinth, grace and peace to you. Even short personal notes followed the form. The way an email today carries a subject line and a signature. A letter without a name was like a knock on the door with nobody standing behind it. This document has no knock. It opens mid-stride, already moving. In the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. That is the first sentence. No author, no location, no date. The voice walks into the room, already talking about the voice of God. As if its own identity were a distraction it had decided to remove. The mystery deepens when you look at the craftsmanship. Across every tradition of scholarship, this document is regarded as some of the most polished and rhetorically sophisticated Greek in the New Testament. The sentences are balanced like architecture. The vocabulary is enormous. The rhythm was built for the ear, with sounds that repeat and land like drum beats. This is the work of someone trained in rhetoric at a high level. A man who knew exactly how good he was. He polished every line. He just never signed one. The early church noticed, and it bothered them for 300 years. Some said Paul, but the style runs differently. And the writer says in chapter 2 that he received the message from those who heard the Lord. Something Paul spent half of Galatians insisting was never true of him. Other names were proposed: Barnabas, Apollos, Luke, Clement. Each candidate with defenders and none with proof. The debate ran through the 2nd and 3rd centuries until Origen, the greatest biblical scholar of his age, reviewed the entire question and closed the file with one sentence that still stands. Who wrote it? God only knows. So the author is a ghost. But here is where the story turns. because this ghost had faces in front of him when he wrote. Read the document like a detective instead of a theologian, and the evidence piles up fast. This writer knew his audience personally. In chapter 10, he reminds them of specific events from their own past. The earlier days when they were publicly insulted, when some of them were thrown in prison, when their property was seized. He knows their history in detail. In chapter 5, he tells them how long they have been believers. Long enough that by now they ought to be teachers. He knows their spiritual age. In chapter 10, he mentions that some of them have been skipping the gatherings. And the way he says it suggests he could name the empty seats. He knows their attendance. In chapter 13, he asks them to pray that he may be restored to them soon. He knows them well enough to miss them. This was never a circular letter blasted out to churches in general. This is a man writing to people he can picture. A specific room full of specific faces. And writing with the kind of urgency you only spend on people you love. Which brings us to the strangest feature of all. The document is a sustained argument. Maybe the most carefully built argument in the Bible. Climbing from the angels to Moses, to the priesthood, to the covenant. Each section, a floor in a rising tower. And 5 times, the builder stops construction. He steps away from the argument, turns to face his audience directly, and sounds a warning. Then he goes back to building. A few chapters later, he stops again. And this warning is harsher. Then again, harsher still. By the 5th alarm, he is talking about a voice that shakes the earth and the heavens. Nobody interrupts himself 5 times over an imaginary danger. Ancient rhetoric had rules. And a digression, this frequent was a choice. A deliberate one. The man saw something coming, and the people he saw it coming for, as far as we can tell, felt fine. One more discovery changes how you should hear everything that follows. Near the end, the document describes its own work. It calls itself a word of exhortation. That phrase had a technical meaning in the 1st century. It was the standard label for a sermon, the kind delivered out loud after the scripture reading in a synagogue service. This document was never meant to be read silently by one person holding a page. It was written to be performed, spoken aloud to a gathered assembly, start to finish, in a single sitting, which means there was a first night, a real evening, in a real room, when someone stood up in front of the community, unrolled this document, and started reading. The people listening had no idea what was in it. They heard the soaring opening about the sun, and then they heard the first alarm, aimed straight at them. We are going to hear it the way they heard it. But first, you need to meet the people in that room, because the alarms were built for them. And until you know what they were carrying, the warnings will sound like they are about someone else. Remember the former days. That is how chapter 10 opens the window into their past. And what stands in that window is worth staring at. There had been a time, years earlier, when this community paid the full price in public. The letter lists it plainly. You were publicly exposed to insult and persecution. The Greek word is theatrizomenoi. It means to be made into theater. These people had been dragged into the open and turned into a spectacle, a public show of humiliation, while their neighbors watched. Some were imprisoned. And then comes the detail that should stop you cold. You joyfully accepted the confiscation of your property, because you knew that you, yourselves, had better and lasting possessions. Sit with that sentence. Officials came and took their homes, their goods, their security, and the emotion these people are remembered for. The emotion the writer can appeal to years later as an established fact is joy. They stood in the street watching their belongings carried off and did the math out loud. We own something better than this, and nobody can carry it away. That is faith with muscle, tested in daylight, in front of hostile crowds. Whatever this community was, it was never soft. That was then. Now, listen to the present tense of the letter. No new persecution is in view when the letter describes their current condition. What it describes is smaller and stranger. Chapter 12 tells them to strengthen your feeble arms and weak knees, the posture of runners who have been on the road too long. Chapter 10 urges them not to give up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing. The word habit matters. This was never one missed gathering. It was a pattern. Seats going empty and staying empty. Quietly. Chapter 5 says they have become dull in their hearing. And chapter 3 warns them about hearts growing hard. Nobody in this room has renounced anything. They are simply, slowly, running out. Put the two portraits side by side, and you get the mystery that drives the whole letter. Persecution could not break these people. Something quieter was now doing what persecution never did. Before going further, one honest card on the table. The letter never names its destination, and scholars still debate it. But a clue near the end, those from Italy send you their greetings, has convinced many readers across the centuries that this letter was traveling toward Rome, carrying hellos from Italian believers living abroad. That reconstruction cannot be proved. And now you know it. For the rest of this story, we will follow it. Because it is the reading the evidence fits best. And because it puts a city, a street, and a decade under the feet of the people in that room. So picture Rome, and picture the exits available to a tired believer there. Because this community had a door out, and the door was nothing like atheism. These believers, as the letter's whole argument assumes, were people soaked in the scriptures of Israel, most naturally Jewish followers of Jesus. Before they ever heard his name, they had a whole spiritual world. The synagogue, the festivals, the food laws, the ancient prayers their families had prayed for generations. And in the Roman world, that older community stood on ground the new one did not have. Jewish communities across the empire carried centuries of history, recognized ancestral customs, hard-won local protections, a place in the city's fabric that even hostile neighbors had learned to live with. The synagogue was old, and in Rome, old meant something. The followers of Jesus had none of that inheritance. Once the movement was seen as something separate from the synagogue, it stood exposed, young, suspicious, easy to blame. So for these particular believers, walking away from Christ would never feel like walking into darkness. It would feel like walking home, back to the familiar melodies, back to family tables that had gone cold toward them, back to a faith their neighbors respected, back to safer ground. Every step of retreat would smell like their childhood. They were being tempted by something far more dangerous than a rival philosophy. They were being tempted by a safer life. And if this letter belongs where many scholars place it, in the 60s of the first century, then the safety question was about to get much sharper. Rome in that decade was ruled by Nero. The city burned in the year 64, and everyone knew the emperor needed someone to blame. He chose the Christians. Tacitus, a Roman historian with no sympathy for the church, recorded what followed. Believers covered in animal skins and torn by dogs. Believers burned as torches to light the imperial gardens at night. We cannot prove whether this letter arrived before that horror or in its early shadow. What we can hear is the letter itself, bracing its readers for something. In your struggle against sin, it says in chapter 12, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. Not yet. 2 words, hanging in the air. So that is the room. Veterans of persecution, who are tired in a way persecution never made them. People drifting toward an exit that feels like home. A city where the cost of staying visible was rising by the year. And a writer, somewhere far away, who can see all of it and can do exactly one thing about it. Right. What he wrote next is the part nobody in the room saw coming. He did not open with the danger. He did not mention the empty seats, the fatigue, the synagogue calling them back. He opened with a hymn. 7 staggering statements about the sun, the radiance of God's glory, the exact imprint of his being, the heir of all things, upholding the universe by the word of his power, seated at the right hand of the majesty on high. For a full chapter, he pulls their eyes upward, higher than the angels, as if to say, before we talk about anything else, look at him again. Remember what you actually have. And then, with their eyes raised, the first alarm sounds. It arrives in a single word that came from the sea. A word that appears exactly once in the entire New Testament, and it names the danger of this letter more precisely than any other word could. We must pay the most careful attention, therefore, to what we have heard, so that we do not drift away. The first alarm hangs on a single Greek word, and the word smells like salt water, parareo. It appears exactly once in the entire New Testament. Right here, in the 2nd chapter of this letter, ancient writers used it for things that flow past and slip away. Water gliding by a fixed point. A ring sliding off a finger without the owner feeling it. Go. And the word invites one picture above the rest. The picture any harbor town would have known by heart. A vessel is moored at nightfall. The knot holds, or seems to, and through the dark hours, without a sound, without a single dramatic moment, the current does its patient work. By morning, the ship is somewhere else. Nobody on board felt it happen. There was no crack of timber, no cry from the deck, no decision. The ship never turned around and sailed away from the harbor. It simply was not held, and the water took it. That is the word this master stylist chose for his first warning. And the choice tells you everything about the danger he saw. He was bracing his people against a current, and currents do their work quietly. Listen to the full sentence, the way that first room heard it. We must pay the most careful attention, therefore, to what we have heard, so that we do not drift away. Now notice what the sentence asks for, because it is almost embarrassingly small. No demand for courage under torture. No call to some heroic act of devotion. Pay attention. That is the entire request. And look at the danger on the other side of the sentence. Nothing about rebellion, blasphemy, or denial. The danger is neglect. The first and gentlest alarm in this letter targets a failure so quiet that most churches would never write a single rule against it. The failure to keep listening to something you already believe. There is a hidden precision here worth slowing down for. Between a person and a truth. 3 different relationships are possible. A person can be ignorant of the truth, meaning he has never heard it. A person can dispute the truth, meaning he has heard it and rejects it. Both of those conditions are visible. You can spot them across a room. But there is a third condition, and this warning aims straight at it. A person can know the truth, agree with the truth, defend the truth if challenged, and no longer actually consider it. The words are still filed somewhere in him. They just stopped weighing anything. Ask him, and he will affirm every doctrine. Watch him, and you will see that none of it is steering. That third condition throws off no signal at all. The man himself cannot feel it, because from the inside, believing something and remembering that you believe something feel identical. The sermon then builds its case with a lawyer's logic, and the argument constructed here will quietly govern the entire letter. So mark it. It reaches back to Sinai, the message spoken through angels, meaning the law given to Moses, proved binding, and every violation of it received its just punishment. That system was real, and its penalties were real. Then comes the turn. How shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? The reasoning runs on a simple scale. The greater the message, the greater the accountability of the one who heard it. If the older, lesser revelation carried consequences, the newer, the greater one cannot carry fewer. And once more, look at the verb chosen for the failure. Neglect. Amilisantis. He could have written reject, and the sentence would have thundered. He wrote neglect, and the sentence does something worse. It removes the excuse of passivity. A man does not have to throw a treasure into the sea to lose it. He only has to stop holding it. Now, put the sentence back into the room where it was first read aloud. The lamps are lit. The reader has just finished the opening chapter. That towering hymn about the Son who upholds the universe by the word of his power. And the room is full of people who have believed this for years. Then the first alarm sounds. And here is the uncomfortable truth about that moment. It is entirely possible that nobody flinched. Not one person in that gathering matched the profile of a spiritual emergency. They were attending. Most of them, they were believing, as far as they could tell. Stop any one of them at the door. Ask about the state of their faith, and you would have heard honest, unalarmed answers. The current does not announce itself to the people it is carrying. That is the whole method of the current. The first warning in Hebrews describes a condition whose only symptom is the absence of symptoms. And it was read to a room full of people who felt fine. Because feeling fine is exactly what drifting feels like. One more detail from the harbor, and it may be the most unsettling one. When a moored ship comes loose at night, the crew sleeping on board experiences nothing. From their side of the rail, if anyone were awake to look, it would seem that the shore itself was moving, sliding backward into the dark while the deck under their feet stayed perfectly still. Drift always feels like standing still. It is everything else that seems to change. The preaching starts to sound flatter than it used to. The community starts to seem colder. The old convictions start to look smaller, further away, like lights on a receding coastline. A drifting person almost never says, "I have moved." He says, "This stopped working for me." He says, "Things are not what they were." The lights on the shore did not move. This letter was written to people watching the lights get smaller and blaming the lights. So the first alarm asks for one thing, attention, and threatens one loss. everything, and the gap between those two sizes is the point. Drift becomes dangerous precisely because it never feels dangerous at the beginning. But a question is now sitting in the middle of the room, and the sermon knows it, because it was built to raise it. If the danger is this quiet, why does anyone stay caught in it? Warn a man about a lion and he runs. Warn a man about a current and he looks at the water, sees nothing, and goes back to his rope. What exactly makes this thing so hard to catch in yourself? The letter has an answer. 3 answers, actually, woven through its pages. And neglect, it turns out, is only the opening move. What is repeatedly ignored does not stay ignored. It goes to work on the person doing the ignoring. Every alarm system has a flaw, and the flaw is always the same. It can only wake people who can still hear it. The author of Hebrews understood this, and you can watch him work around it. Threaded through his sermon are 3 quiet mechanisms, 3 reasons the people he loved could sit in a gathering, hear the words of life read aloud, and register nothing. He never lists them as a set, but lay the letter flat and they surface on their own. And the first one explains the deafness better than anything else in the ancient world. Call it familiarity. In chapter 5, the sermon drops a detail about its audience that reframes everything. By this time, it tells them, you ought to be teachers. Read that again for what it admits. These were never new believers, still learning the vocabulary. They had years of hearing behind them, enough years to have mastered the material and started instructing others. Their problem was never a shortage of input. Their problem was what long exposure does to the human ear. A family buys a house beside the railroad tracks, and for the first month, the night train shakes them out of sleep. By the second year, they do not hear it at all. Guests wake in terror while the household sleeps on. The sound never changed. The hearing did. These people had lived beside the gospel for so long that the train ran straight through their gathering every week and nobody stirred. And here is the proof that the diagnosis was exactly this disease. Look at the cure. The entire strategy of Hebrews is to make familiar things strange again. The sermon drags its audience into the oddest corners of their own scriptures. A priest-king named Melchizedek, with no genealogy. The furniture of the tabernacle. The blood of goats and calves. And it uses all of it to force them to look at Jesus as if for the first time. Information would never wake these people. Only astonishment would. The second mechanism is delay, and the letter fights it with a single word, repeated like a hammer. Today, in chapters 3 and 4, the sermon quotes the same line from the 95th Psalm 5 separate times. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. 5 times. No other Old Testament sentence gets treatment like that in this letter. And the repetition is aimed at something specific. The most disarming answer a human being can give to the voice of God is postponement. Nobody in that Roman gathering had decided to leave Christ. They had decided, without ever wording it, to get serious later, after the pressure eased, after the danger passed, after life settled. Refusal, at least, has the honesty of a decision. Postponement feels like obedience on a technicality, because the postponing man agrees with everything and surrenders nothing. The sermon saw the trick clearly, which is why its prescription in chapter 3 carries a timestamp. Encourage one another daily. It says, as long as it is called today, daily, because the disease renews itself daily. Today is the only day the voice ever speaks. And later is the only day the drifting man ever plans to answer. The third mechanism is the subtlest, because it does not look like loss at all. Call it substitution. A drifting believer almost never leaves a hole where his faith used to be. Holes are noticeable. Holes ash. What happens instead is that something else slides into the space. Something respectable enough to pass inspection. And for the people in that room, the replacement on offer was nothing like a vice or a rival philosophy. It was the temple system itself, the priesthood, the sacrifices, the ancient rituals of their fathers. Stop and feel the weight of that. The thing calling them backward was a thing God himself had given, glorious in its day, commanded at Sinai, soaked in centuries of holy memory. This is why the sermon spends its massive center, chapters 7 through 10, on what looks at first like an obscure argument about priesthoods and covenants. It is answering the substitution directly, proving line by line that the old system was a shadow and the Son is the substance. That going back to the shadow after meeting the substance is a catastrophic trade. Because the author understood the real shape of the temptation, almost nobody drifts towards something worse. People drift towards something easier, older, safer, often something genuinely good. And they let the good thing quietly take the seat that belonged to Christ. Drift rarely pulls a man toward the dark. It pulls him toward the comfortable. 3 mechanisms. Then, all running at once in one tired community. Familiarity was closing their ears. Delay was spending their calendar. Substitution was preparing their exit and dressing it up as a homecoming. And still, a person might hear all of this and shrug. So, attention fade. So people coast for a season. Where is the emergency? Neglect seems like such a survivable sin. A weed in the yard. Unsightly, but harmless. The author knew his audience would think exactly that. So for his second alarm, he reached past argument entirely and pulled out a story, the darkest one in his people's memory. It concerns an entire generation that stood on the edge of everything God had promised them. A generation that had seen more miracles with their own eyes than any group of human beings in history. Neglect did not stay neglect for them. It aged into something with a harder name. And the sentence, for it was 40 years long, and the desert still holds their graves. 11 days. That is the walking distance from Mount Sinai to the southern edge of the Promised Land. And an entire nation once stood at the end of it, close enough to send scouts over the border. The place was called Kadesh Barnea. 12 men went north into the hill country while the people waited in the camp. And after 40 days, the 12 came back carrying proof. A cluster of grapes from the valley of Eshcol, so heavy it swung from a pole between 2 men. All 12 scouts told the same story about the facts. The land flows with milk and honey, exactly as promised. The land also holds walled cities and giants. Same report, same grapes, same giant. The split came at the conclusion. 2 of the men, Caleb and Joshua, looked at the facts and said, "We should go up at once, for we are well able." The other 10 looked at the same facts and said, "We are not able. We were like grasshoppers in our own eyes." That night, the camp chose which conclusion to believe. The people wept in the dark, and the weeping turned to a vote. And the vote was a sentence nobody should read quickly. "Let us choose a leader." They said, and go back to Egypt, back to the slave quarters, back to the brick pits. The place they had begged God to rescue them from had softened in their memory into something bearable. Because the road ahead demanded a trust they had decided to keep in their pockets. Now hold the camera on this crowd for a moment. Because who they were is the whole point. These were the last people on earth you would expect to break this way. This exact generation had watched the Red Sea stand up in walls and had walked between them on dry ground. They had eaten bread that appeared on the desert floor every morning of their lives. They drank from rock. They followed a pillar of cloud through the day and slept under a pillar of fire at night. If miracles produced faithfulness, these people should have been the most faithful human beings who ever lived. They had seen more of the raw power of God than Abraham ever saw, more than David would, more than the prophets. And at the border of everything, they wanted Egypt. Read the account carefully, and the strangeness surfaces. There was no idol at Kadesh Barnea, no massacre, no dramatic crime. The nation simply stood at a threshold and declined to cross it. Their failure was a refusal to move, a decision shaped like no decision at all. And the judgment that answered it was measured in time. 40 years in the wilderness. 1 year for every day the scouts had spent in the land. Until every adult who had voted for Egypt was buried in the sand. The children they had claimed to be protecting grew up walking past the graves. And it was those children who finally crossed the Jordan, on the same route their parents had refused. Centuries later, a psalm reached back to that story and pressed it into a warning. It became the 95th Psalm, and the psalm has a strange shape. It opens as pure celebration. Come, let us sing for joy to the Lord. Let us shout aloud to the rock of our salvation. Then, mid-song, the music turns and a voice cuts in. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as you did at Meribah. As you did that day at Massah in the wilderness. The song ends with God's oath. They shall never enter my rest. A worship song with a graveyard in the second verse. Here is why that matters for the room in Rome. This psalm belonged to the scriptural world these believers knew from the inside. A song woven deep enough into Israel's worship that people could finish it from memory if you gave them the first line. And the sermon takes that familiar song, holds it up in front of them, and points at one word they had sung past 1,000 times. Today. Then comes an argument built like a legal brief, with the document in hand. Notice, the sermon says in effect, when this psalm was written, Hebrews locates that word today in the voice of David. Centuries after the wilderness, generation was dust, which can only mean one thing. The door called today did not close at Kadesh Barnea. God was still holding it open in David's lifetime, still saying, today, to a new generation. And if the word was alive in David's day, it is alive in the room where this sermon is being read. The invitation into rest still stands. That word in their old song was never a piece of history. It was a door, propped open. And a door held open this long can still be walked through, and can still be left. And with the door in view, the sermon names what happens to people who keep standing outside it. Do not harden your hearts. That phrase deserves precision, because we usually get it wrong. A hard heart, in the way this letter means it, is nothing like a cold heart. The wilderness generation felt enormously. They wept all night at Kadesh. They were terrified and homesick and moved. A hard heart is something more specific and more chilling. It is a heart that has learned how to resist what it knows. Refusal, practiced long enough, stops being a choice and becomes a reflex. The way a callus forms exactly where the friction is. Every time the voice speaks and a person feels the pull and declines it. Saying no gets slightly cheaper. The 100th refusal costs almost nothing. That is why the generation that saw the most could trust the least. Miracles never soften hearts. Response does. And they had spent years practicing the other thing. Which is why the prescription attached to this warning sounds, at first, almost too small for the disease. Encourage one another daily, as long as it is called today, so that none of you may be hardened by sin's deceitfulness. Look closely at the logic packed in there. Hardening is deceitful, meaning the person it is happening to is the last person able to see it. The callus grows on the inside, where the owner has no mirror. So the sermon never tells the drifting man to examine himself harder. It tells the people around the drifting man to speak daily. Your friend can see the border you have stopped at. Your friend can hear the Egypt in your voice before you can. In this letter, community is a survival mechanism. The early warning system for a condition that hides from its host. The wilderness generation never lacked evidence. They stood on evidence, ate evidence every morning, drank it from the rock. By the end, the problem was no longer what they had seen. The problem was what they could no longer hear. And hearing is exactly where the third alarm aims. Because when the sermon looks up from the ancient story and back at the actual room in front of it, at these veterans of persecution drifting toward the exits, it is about to say the most personal and insulting thing in its 13 chapters. It is about to tell them what years of practiced not listening has done to them. To them, by name, in the present tense. It happens in the middle of a sentence, and you can almost hear the scroll stop. The sermon is climbing toward the summit of its whole argument. It has just introduced the strangest and most electrifying figure in its pages. Melchizedek, the ancient priest king of Salem, the key that unlocks who Jesus actually is. Any teacher lives for this moment. The deep material, the real treasure. And right at the threshold of it, the brakes slam. We have much to say about this, but it is hard to make it plain to you, because you have become dull of hearing. Feel that landing in the room. The reader has been carrying the congregation upward for 5 chapters. And now, in front of everyone, the sermon turns and addresses the listeners directly. And what it says is, I cannot teach you this. The material is within your reach. Your ears are the problem. It is one of the most confrontational sentences in the New Testament. A teacher telling a room of veterans that they have lost a capacity they used to have. The hinge of the sentence is one word: become. You have become dull of hearing. The Greek word for dull is nothros. Sluggish, slow, numb. The word you would use for a limb that has gone to sleep. And become means this was never their native condition. Nobody is born with these ears. There was a time, and the author knows it because he knows them. When these same people heard everything, the word cut them, moved them, cost them property, and they counted it joy. Dullness is an acquired condition, the residue of years. The interest paid on 1,000 small refusals. This is a diagnosis with a timeline in it. A doctor looking at a scan and saying, this has been developing for a decade. Then the chart gets read out loud. with an image chosen to sting. By this time you ought to be teachers. But you need someone to teach you the elementary truths of God's Word all over again. You need milk, not solid food. Anyone who lives on milk is still an infant. The picture is deliberately uncomfortable. A grown man with a bottle, and the discomfort is the point. Because spiritual stalling should feel uncomfortable and had stopped feeling like anything. But notice where the problem sits. It was never a shortage of knowledge. These people could probably recite more doctrine than most modern believers will ever learn. The problem is that knowledge had stopped converting into anything. Input with no response. Hearing with no yield. A man can know everything and be changed by none of it. The sermon seals that idea with a picture from the sky. Land that drinks in the rain, often falling on it, and produces a crop useful to the farmer, receives the blessing of God. But land that produces thorns and thistles is worthless. Hold the image still. Two fields, side by side. The same clouds pass over both. The same rain falls on both. The same inches. The same seasons. One field answers the rain with wheat. The other answers it with thorns. Nobody walking those fields would blame the rain. Whatever went wrong in the soil. In what the ground did with what it was given. These believers had been rained on for years. Sermon after sermon. Mercy after mercy. The question of the third alarm was never, have you received? It is, what has the receiving produced? And it is here, between the milk and the fields, that the sermon plants the most feared sentences in the letter. And we are going to walk straight through them. It is impossible. It says, for those who have once been enlightened, who have tasted the heavenly gift, who have shared in the Holy Spirit, who have tasted the goodness of the Word of God and the powers of the coming age, and who have fallen away, to be brought back to repentance, because to their loss they are crucifying the Son of God all over again and subjecting him to public disgrace. Honesty requires saying this plainly. That passage is one of the most debated in the entire New Testament, and the debate runs between careful readers on all sides. And it has run for centuries. Some traditions read it exactly as it sounds. A real warning to real believers that genuine apostasy is genuinely possible. That a person can walk in the light and then finally, fully, walk out of it. Other traditions read the warning as the very instrument God uses to keep his people, the guardrail whose whole purpose is to be heeded, so that true believers hear the alarm, tremble, and hold fast, which is precisely how God preserves them to the end. Still, others draw the line between belonging to the community and belonging to Christ, arguing that a person can be enlightened, can taste, can share in the life of the church, and still turn out never to have been rooted. Serious. Faithful scholars sit in every one of those camps. And this story will not pretend to settle a question the church has carried for 2,000 years. But notice what every camp agrees on, because the agreement is the message. Nobody who takes this letter seriously reads these verses as harmless. The sermon is describing a real trajectory with a real end. A person who does not stumble, does not doubt, does not wander for a season, but who deliberately, permanently walks away from the one sacrifice that exists, and in doing so joins the crowd at the crucifixion, ratifying the verdict of Golgotha with his own life. The horror of the passage is not a God who slams the door on someone begging to come in. The horror is a person who has stopped knocking, who has seen the only remedy and renounced it. leaving, by definition, no remedy left. There is no second cross. And then, before the room can even exhale, comes a move. Almost no one sees coming, and it may be the most important one in the entire sermon. With the smoke of that warning still in the air, the very next sentence begins. Even though we speak like this, dear friends, we are convinced of better things in your case, the things that have to do with salvation. Dear friends, beloved, search this letter from the first line to the last, and you will find that word exactly once. Here, pressed directly against the most terrifying paragraph the man ever wrote. From a craftsman, this deliberate, that placement is a decision. The hardest sentence and the tenderest address, welded together on purpose. We are convinced of better things concerning you. He does not believe the people in that room have crossed the line he just described. He believes they are drifting toward it, which is exactly why the alarm sounds at full volume. And an alarm at full volume is a thing you sound for people who can still get out. One more word belongs here, quietly, for a certain kind of listener. In every generation since this letter was written, the people most haunted by these verses have been tender consciences. Believers lying awake, afraid they have committed the unforgivable, fallen past the point of return. Read the passage once more and look at who it describes. It describes people who no longer care, people crucifying the Son of God without a flinch, people done with the whole question. The fear of having fallen away is an experience those people no longer have. The ache itself is evidence of life. The nerve still firing, the ear still working. The dead field does not worry about the rain. So the third alarm ends in the strangest place yet. A dreadful warning, holding hands with a declaration of confidence. And that pairing raises a question the sermon now has to answer. The room has absorbed 3 alarms in a row. Drift, hardening, dullness, each one closer to the bone than the last. These people are exhausted. Fear cannot carry them the remaining distance. And the author knows it, because fear has never once anchored a human soul. So the warnings pause, and the sermon reaches back into the same sea that gave it the first alarm. The drifting ship, the current nobody feels, and it pulls out a second word from the water. The current, it turns out, was never the whole story of the harbor. The first warning in this letter borrowed a word from the sea, pararreo, the ship slipping its mooring, the drift nobody feels. Now, in chapter 6, with the echo of the hardest warning still hanging in the air, the sermon goes back to the harbor for one more word. And this time, it is the answer to the first one. We have this hope, it says, as an anchor for the soul, firm and secure. Same author, the same vocabulary of the sea, 2 ends of the same rope. The man who named the current now names the thing that beats it. And you should feel the design in that pairing, because it means the remedy was built into the same picture as the diagnosis. The question of this whole letter is a sailor's question. What is going to hold this vessel when the water moves? And the answer is nothing like the vigilance of the crew. The answer is an anchor, which is to say, something outside the ship entirely. Then the sermon tells you where this anchor is lodged, and the location breaks the metaphor wide open on purpose. Every anchor in the ancient world went down, into dark water, into mud and rock on the sea floor, into the lowest place. This one goes up. It enters. The letter says, the inner sanctuary behind the curtain, where Jesus, who went before us, has entered on our behalf. Behind the curtain, every listener in that Roman room felt the temperature of those words instantly, because they knew exactly what stood behind the curtain, and they knew who was allowed there. The innermost chamber of the temple, the most holy place, the one room on earth where the presence of God was said to dwell. One man could enter it, the high priest, one day a year, the Day of Atonement, and he did not stroll in. He went through washings and sacrifices and clouds of incense, carrying blood, and tradition remembers the dread of that room. The sense that the holiest man in the nation was stepping across a line no one crosses casually. The place behind the curtain was the most restricted space in the ancient world, sealed 364 days a year. That is where their anchor is set. The sermon says, hooked into the most unshakable place that exists, the presence of God itself. On the far side of the curtain that kept everyone out, their hope was fastened to a room, and the room could not move. And then one more word, and it may be the most beautiful one in the chapter. Jesus entered that place. The letter says, as a prodromos, a forerunner. The word was used for a scout sent ahead of an army to secure the route. The one who goes first so that others can follow. Sailors have long loved a picture that goes with it, worth holding even if the first hearers never thought of boats at all. A heavy ship cannot always reach its harbor against the wind, so a smaller, faster vessel runs ahead, carrying the ship's anchor, and sets it firm in the safe water inside. And then the great ship is drawn in on its own line, pulled toward an anchor already placed. Whatever picture the first listeners saw, the claim of the sentence is exactly that shape. Someone has already run the harbor ahead of them. Their anchor was never waiting to be set. It is set, carried behind the curtain by one who went first. And the rope between the ship and the anchor does not run from their hands to him. It runs from him to them. This is the moment to say out loud what the middle chapters of this letter keep insisting, because it is the engine under everything. 2 chapters earlier, the point was already on the table. Since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. And then, the sentence this whole tired room needed. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet without sin. Let us then approach the throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Look at the direction of every verb. Approach, receive, find. Not one of them says, perform. The high priests of their childhood entered the holy place once a year and came right back out, because the room was unsurvivable as a residence. This priest, chapter 7 says, holds his priesthood permanently. And then comes a phrase that ought to be read slowly in every generation. He always lives to intercede for them. Always lives. The watch behind the curtain never changes, shifts. Whatever hour the ship starts to slide, the far end of the rope is held by someone whose entire occupation, at this moment, is holding it. Now, a fair listener might raise an objection right here, and it deserves a straight answer. If the anchor is that secure, why the alarms? If the rope is held from the other end, why spend 5 warnings trying to scare the crew? Doesn't all this assurance make the warnings unnecessary? Or worse, make drifting safe? Watch how the letter itself answers. Because the answer is in its rhythm. Every single time this sermon says, "Come near," it first says, Since we have a great high priest, let us hold firmly. Since we have confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus, let us draw near. The assurance is never a pillow in this letter. It is ground. It is the reason a drifting person can do anything at all. Because a man who believes the door is shut does not walk toward the door. The wilderness generation at Kadesh Barnea did not die of weakness. They died of the conviction that they could not, that the giants were final, that the promise would not hold their weight. Unbelief is always a verdict about God before it is a behavior. So the sermon spends its center proving the one thing despair cannot survive, that the way in is open and the anchor is already set. Assurance in Hebrews is never permission to drift. It is the reason a drifting person can come back. Hope as an anchor. The word has gone soft in modern English. A wish with no weight on it. I hope it works out. I hope the weather holds. Hope in this letter is a fixed object in a fixed place. And the soul tied to it can feel everything. A storm makes a soul feel, and still not travel. But an anchor, honestly held, forces one last question, and the letter is too honest to leave it unasked. A rope can be held perfectly from the far end and still be let go from the near one. Not slipped, not lost in a storm, released, with both eyes open, by a hand that knows exactly what it is holding. The first 3 alarms were about the current, the slow, unfelt, passive slide of a ship nobody is steering. The 4th alarm is different in kind. And the whole sermon has been building toward it since its first sentence. It is about the moment drifting stops being something that happens to a person and becomes something a person chooses. And it begins, of all places, with an open door and an invitation to walk through it. The 4th alarm opens with the widest door in the entire letter. Therefore, brothers and sisters, since we have confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way opened for us through the curtain, let us draw near to God with a sincere heart and with the full assurance that faith brings. Hear what is actually being said there. Against everything that room knew about curtains, the most restricted space in the world. To the room, one man entered one day a year, now has a new and living way through it. And the invitation is addressed to everyone listening. Draw near. Then the invitations stack up, one after another. Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess. For he who promised is faithful. Let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds. Let us not give up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but let us encourage one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. Draw near, hold fast, consider one another. Keep showing up. 4 movements, all of them toward, none of them away. That is the setting of the 4th alarm. And the setting is the argument, because the warning that comes next is aimed past the people who stumble on the way through the door. It is about people who stand in front of an open door. Know it is open. Know what opened it, and walk the other direction. If we deliberately keep on sinning after we have received the knowledge of the truth, no sacrifice for sins is left, but only a fearful expectation of judgment. The sentence has terrified readers for 20 centuries, and much of the terror comes from misreading one word, deliberately, taken alone. That word seems to sweep in almost everything, because what honest person has never sinned with open eyes? If every willful sin forfeits the sacrifice, then the sacrifice covers no one, and the letter has just contradicted its own gospel. So slow down and let the letter define its own terms. Because it does. 3 sentences later, the person in view has trampled the Son of God underfoot, has treated as an unholy thing the blood of the covenant that sanctified them, and has insulted the Spirit of grace. Trampled underfoot. That is a picture of contempt. A boot coming down on purpose. Again and again. On the one thing in the universe that could save the man wearing the boot. 3 different people stand in this passage, and everything depends on telling them apart. There is the believer at war with his sin, losing battles, hating the losses, dragging himself back to the fight. The letter has already told that man exactly where to go, to the throne of grace, with confidence, to find help in his time of need. There is the believer who falls and repents, and the entire priesthood argument of chapters 7 through 10 exists for him. A high priest who always lives to intercede. And then there is a third figure, the one this warning names. A man done with the remedy itself. A man who has examined the one sacrifice that exists and rendered his verdict on it worthless, and now lives that verdict permanently, with clear eyes. For that man, no sacrifice for sins is left, and the logic is as cold and simple as arithmetic. There is one cross. The man has renounced it. What exactly would be left? Now, why? Aim this warning at this room. These were no scoffers. Nobody in that gathering was trampling anything. And here the sermon turns and looks straight at what they were actually doing, and gives it a name that should unsettle every comfortable generation since. Shrinking back. My righteous one will live by faith. The letter quotes, and I take no pleasure in the one who shrinks back. The Greek word is hupostello, and it is a quiet, respectable, almost dignified word. Greek writers used it for drawing back, for pulling in, the kind of word that fits a sail being lowered, a soldier easing backward out of the line, a man trimming what he says because of who is listening. Nothing in the word snaps or shatters. Everything in it retreats by inches. Put that word back into its city and its decade, and feel what it actually looked like. This was Rome in the 60s, meeting together. That phrase, from the invitation, was the single most visible, most incriminating thing a believer did. A gathering in a house could be seen, counted, reported, and the empire's mood was turning from suspicion toward hunger. So the retreat, when it came, looked nothing like apostasy. It looked like prudence. A man misses the gathering this week because the neighborhood has eyes. He still believes everything. He tells himself, and it is true. Next month he misses too. He keeps his faith. Just quieter now. More portable. More private. A faith that leaves no footprints. He avoids the brother whose arrest is coming. From distance. From timing, never from malice. Nothing in this sequence feels like trampling the Son of God. Every single step feels like common sense. That is the terror of the fourth alarm, and the reason it stands here. After 3 alarms about currents and calluses and dull ears, the sermon is tracing where the drift finally surfaces. The slide that began as inattention has become, at last, a series of choices, each one small, each one defensible, each one away. Spiritual retreat becomes most dangerous at exactly the moment it starts to feel reasonable, and no one in that room could see the sequence from inside it. Which is why the sermon now does something no argument could do. It opens their own photo album. Remember those earlier days? It says, after you had received the light, when you endured in a great conflict full of suffering, sometimes you were publicly exposed to insult and persecution. At other times, you stood side by side with those who were so treated. You suffered along with those in prison and joyfully accepted the confiscation of your property, because you knew that you yourselves had better and lasting possessions, their own history held up in front of them. And the argument inside the memory has blades. You were there. It says, when standing with prisoners could cost you everything, you stood in daylight, by name. When they carried your belongings out of your houses, you rejoiced, out loud, in the street, because you had run the numbers and Christ came out ahead. Courage is a thing you own and have stopped using. The men and women lowering their sails in Rome were the same men and women who had once done the bravest math in the city. The sermon asks them for nothing new. It asks them to recognize themselves. Then it tells them the stakes of the memory. Do not throw away your confidence. It will be richly rewarded. Throw away. You cannot throw away what you do not hold. The confidence was still theirs, still in hand. And the only way to lose it now was a decision. And then comes the move this letter makes after every alarm. The move whose full pattern we will not see until the end. Having said the most frightening words, the sermon refuses to end on them, and it plants a flag with its people. But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and are saved. Read the pronoun. We, the author, in the same boat, the same water, the same decade, binding his own fate to theirs in a single sentence of defiance. It reads less like a warning now than a declaration of identity, spoken on behalf of people too tired to speak it themselves. This is who we are. We do not lower the sail. 4 alarms now, and the shape of the journey is almost visible. A drift nobody feels, a hardening nobody notices, a dullness nobody chose, a retreat everybody can justify. Each stage quieter on the outside, each stage further in, which leaves only the last door, the one at the bottom of the sequence, saved for the summit of the sermon, because the final alarm moves past attention, past endurance, past courage, down to the bedrock under all of them. It is about a voice, the one that has been speaking since the first sentence of this letter, and the question of whether a person, at the end of a long, slow, reasonable retreat, can stand in front of that voice and refuse it. The last alarm begins with the smell of soup. A man comes in from the open country with nothing to show for the hunt. His name is Esau, and he is the firstborn of Isaac, which in his world means he is carrying something enormous and invisible. The birthright, a double share of the inheritance, headship of the family, and in this particular family something more, because this is the line of Abraham, the line carrying the promise that through it every nation on earth would be blessed. All of that rides on the firstborn, and the firstborn is hungry, and his younger brother is standing over a pot of lentil stew. The exchange takes 4 sentences. Esau asks for the stew. Jacob names his price. The birthright Esau does his arithmetic out loud, and it sounds so sensible. Look, I am about to die. What good is the birthright to me? Then he swears the oath, and he eats. Genesis closes the scene with 5 verbs, stacked like stones on a grave. He ate, and he drank, and he rose, and he went his way. Then the 5th verb, the one that reads like a coroner's finding. So Esau despised his birthright. Notice what the text refuses to say. Nothing about a trick, though his brother was a schemer. Nothing about false hunger or imagined exhaustion. The hunger was real. The relief was real. What the verdict says is that the trade only made public a price tag that had been hanging inside Esau for a long time. A man does not sell in one afternoon what he treasures. He sells what he has already. Privately, quietly marked down. The transaction took a moment. The despising had been going on for years, unwitnessed, in the place where a man decides what things are worth. The bowl of soup did not create the contempt. It revealed it. Hebrews reaches for this exact story at the peak of its final warning, and attaches to it the most haunting sentence in the letter. See that no one is sexually immoral, or is godless like Esau, who for a single meal sold his inheritance rights as the oldest son. Afterward, as you know, when he wanted to inherit this blessing, he was rejected. Even though he sought the blessing with tears, he could not change what he had done. He sought it with tears. Years later, when the blessing was being given and Esau finally understood what he had traded away, Genesis records that he cried out with a loud and bitter cry, one of the rawest sounds in the whole Old Testament, and the tears changed nothing. Handle this carefully, because the point is narrower and colder than a God who turns away weeping men. The whole letter has been one long argument that the throne is approachable and the priest is sympathetic. What the Esau story says is that some trades are simply final. The tears were real, but they arrived at the moment of loss, long after the moment of despising, and there are doors that stand open for years and then are simply behind you. This is Kadesh Barnea again, compressed into a single man at a single table. An entire generation had wept all night once. 2. On the wrong side of their own decision. Why does Esau stand here, at the entrance of the final alarm? Because he is what the whole trajectory of this letter looks like when it finishes. Every stage of the slide is a form of undervaluing, a slow, private markdown of the treasure. And Esau is the markdown made visible. The people in that Roman room were nothing like scoffers or rebels. Neither was Esau. He was just a hungry man making a reasonable trade in a weak moment. And the reasonable trade told the truth about his heart. Then the sermon lifts its eyes from the table, and the scale changes completely. 2 mountains rise up. The first is Sinai, painted the way the old stories remembered it. A mountain burning with fire, wrapped in darkness, gloom and storm. A trumpet blast growing louder and louder, and a voice speaking words so heavy that the people who heard it begged for it to stop. The mountain was fenced off, and the rule was death, even for an animal that touched the base. The sight was so terrifying. The letter says that Moses himself, the man who walked into the cloud, said, "I am trembling with fear." That was the mountain of the Old Covenant. God present, and the entire arrangement built to keep everyone back. You have not come to that mountain. The sermon says, then it tells them what they have come to. And the verb tense matters, because it is present. You have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. You have come to thousands upon thousands of angels in joyful assembly. The Greek word there is panegeris, a festival gathering, the word for a holiday crowd, angels beyond counting, and all of them celebrating. You have come to the church of the firstborn, to God, the judge of all, to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. That last line deserves a breath of its own. Abel's blood, the first blood ever spilled by human violence, cried out from the ground. And what it cried for was justice against the guilty. This blood also speaks, and it says something better. Abel's blood demanded a verdict. This blood announces 1, forgiven, 2, mountains, then, and the geometry of the whole letter inside them. Sinai, where the voice spoke and everyone was held at a distance. Zion, where the same voice speaks and everyone is invited near, into the festival itself. Now watch the turn, because this is where the final alarm detonates, and it lands exactly where a listener would least expect it. You would think the invitation softens the stakes. Zion is a party, after all, and Sinai was a fence. The sermon reasons in precisely the opposite direction. With the same logic it laid down in its very first alarm. Back in chapter 2, see to it that you do not refuse him who speaks. If they did not escape when they refused him who warned them on earth, how much less will we, if we turn away from him who warns us from heaven? The privilege does not shrink the responsibility. The privilege is the responsibility. At Sinai, the people refused, a voice speaking from a mountain they could see, through a fence they could not cross. And it did not go well for them. To refuse the voice at close range, inside the festival, with the blood still speaking its better word, is the largest offense there is. Then, one more line of scripture, from the prophet Haggai, and the whole room shakes with it. Once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. Once more, the sermon explains, means the removing of what can be shaken. That is, created things, so that what cannot be shaken may remain. Stand inside that sentence, in that room, in that city. Everything those believers were tempted to retreat toward was on the shakeable list. The temple in Jerusalem, with its priesthood and its sacrifices, the safe and ancestral system calling them home, had less than a decade left before Roman legions leveled it to the foundation stones. The empire itself, the whole apparatus of power that made the gatherings dangerous, was on the list too. And notice what the shaking is for. It is pictured as a revealing. You shake a tree and nothing happens to the tree except the truth. What is loose comes down. What is rooted stays. The question the fifth alarm leaves in the room is quiet and enormous. Of all the things your life is currently standing on, which ones are on the removable list? And what will still be under your feet when everything on that list is gone? Therefore, the sermon says, since we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us be thankful, and so worship God acceptably with reverence and awe. And with that, the arc that began in chapter 2 closes like a circle. Lay the first alarm and the last alarm side by side and read them as one sentence, because they were written as one. The first said, we must pay the most careful attention to what we have heard, so that we do not drift away. The last says, "See to it that you do not refuse him who speaks." Between those two sentences, the danger has traveled its full distance. From a message to a person, from drifting off a truth to refusing a voice, because that is what the drift was always moving toward. And the letter knew it from its opening line. God has spoken to us by his Son. The thing being neglected was never a doctrine on a shelf. It was a speaking presence. And drift, followed all the way down, ends as a man standing inside the festival, at the foot of the mountain that cannot be shaken, hearing a voice that is still speaking, and saying no to it. 5 alarms. 1 trajectory. That is the journey. But it is not yet the whole letter. Because when you lay all 5 alarms out on the table together, side by side, in order, something else comes into view. A pattern hiding in plain sight. One that most readers never notice, because the alarms are so loud. And once you see it, it changes what this letter actually is. Put all 5 alarms on the table. Look at them together, in order, the way almost nobody ever does. Because almost everybody meets them one at a time, with chapters of theology in between, seen in a row. They form a staircase, each step more severe than the last, drifting, hardening, falling away, trampling, refusing. That much we have traced. Now look at something else. Look at what stands directly in front of each alarm. Look at what the sermon says immediately before it rings each bell. Before the first alarm, chapter 1, the highest description of Jesus in the New Testament. The Son is the radiance of God's glory, the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word, superior to the angels. Then, and only then, therefore, pay attention. Do not drift. Before the second alarm, the argument that Jesus is greater than Moses. Moses was faithful as a servant in God's house, but Christ is faithful as the Son over God's house. Then, and only then, the wilderness, the graves, do not harden your hearts. Before the third alarm, the introduction of Melchizedek, the priest, king, the doorway into the deepest teaching in the letter, a priesthood older than Aaron and permanent as an oath. Then, and only then, you have become dull of hearing, and the fearful words about falling away. Before the fourth alarm, the summit of the entire argument, the sacrifice offered once for all time. By one sacrifice he has made perfect forever those who are being made holy. The curtain is open. The new and living way is announced. The invitation pour out. Then, and only then, the warning about trampling and shrinking back. And before the fifth alarm, Mount Zion itself, the festival of angels, the city of the living God, the blood that speaks a better word. Then, and only then, see that you do not refuse him who speaks. Do you see it? Not one of the 5 alarms follows a rebuke. Every single alarm in this letter stands in the shadow of a revelation. First, the sermon raises the ceiling. Then it sounds the bell. And the bell is always exactly as loud as the ceiling is high. A greater son than the angels. So, a warning about neglecting a great salvation. A greater mediator than Moses. So, a warning about a greater unbelief. A greater priest than Aaron. So, a warning about a greater dullness. A greater sacrifice than the temple. So, a warning about a greater contempt. a greater mountain than Sinai. So the greatest warning of all. This is the letter's entire logic, announced plainly in the very first alarm. If we were listening, if the message spoken through angels was binding, how shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? The scale of the warning is set by the scale of the gift. Small gifts, neglected. Cost, little. A man who ignores a pamphlet has lost a pamphlet. This letter spends 13 chapters establishing that what these people were drifting from is the largest thing that exists. The Son who upholds the universe. The sacrifice that ends all sacrifices. The kingdom that survives the shaking of heaven and earth. The alarms are severe because the treasure is enormous, which means the 5 warnings of Hebrews were never 5 threats. They are 5 shadows, and each shadow is cast by a glory. The sermon does not scare its people with darkness. It alarms them with light. That is the first half of the pattern. The second half is even easier to miss, and it changes the temperature of the whole letter. Look now at what stands directly after each alarm. Look at the very next thing the sermon says once the hard words are out of its mouth. After the first alarm, within a few sentences, this, both the one who makes people holy and those who are made holy are of the same family. So Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters. Not ashamed of them. That is the first thing he wants ringing in their ears after the first warning. After the second alarm, with the wilderness graves still in view, this, let us then approach the throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. The door at Kadesh Barnea closed on a generation. The very next move of the sermon is to fling a door open. After the third alarm, the hardest words in the letter, the impossible passage, and pressed directly against it, the sentence we have already stood beside. Even though we speak like this, dear friends, we are convinced of better things in your case. Beloved, the one time in the entire letter that word appears, and it is spent there. In the smoke of the severest warning, after the fourth alarm, trampling, judgment, raging fire, and immediately, the photo album, the memory of their bravest days, and then the flag planted in the first-person plural. But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and are saved. The author does not stand at a distance and grade them. He climbs into the boat, and after the fifth alarm, the shaking of heaven and earth, the removal of everything removable, and the very next breath, since we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us be thankful. The last word, after the last warning, is gratitude. Receiving, present tense. The kingdom is already changing hands. 5 alarms, 5 times, without a single exception. The immediate next move is an embrace. Warning, then welcome, severity, then family, fire, then beloved. The rhythm never breaks once across 13 chapters. And a craftsman, this careful, does not repeat a structure 5 times by chance. The pattern is the letter. He rings the bell with one hand and pulls them close with the other. And he never does one without the other. Now step all the way back, because from this distance you can finally see what this document actually is. For 20 centuries, readers have handled the warning passages of Hebrews like a problem to be solved. 5 frightening texts to be explained, softened, debated, assigned to somebody else. Whole theological systems have squared off over them. And underneath all of it, quietly, The shape of the thing has been sitting in plain sight. A man who knew his people were sliding, who could see the current they could not feel, sat down and did the only thing distance allowed him to do. He wrote 5 times in one sermon. He interrupted his own masterpiece to grab them, because politeness does not wake sleepers. And 5 times he caught them before the fear could curdle into despair. Because fear has never anchored anyone. Raise the ceiling, ring the bell, pull them close. 5 times, all the way up the staircase, all the way to Zion. An alarm is not a verdict. Nobody wires an alarm into a building they have written off. You install alarms in the buildings you intend to keep. And the louder the alarm, the more certain you can be about what the builder thinks the building is worth. The 5 warnings of Hebrews exist for one reason, and the pattern proves it. The man who wrote them believed all the way to his final page that the people hearing them could still turn around, which leaves just one question. The sermon never asks its people whether they once began well. It has their history in hand. The prison visits, the joy in the street, the bravest math in Rome. And it never once questions any of it. The question it asks, instead, lives in a different tense entirely. The present, inside the one word it hammered 5 times from their oldest song. The word that outlived the wilderness, outlived David, outlived the temple, and did not stop when the scroll was rolled up on that first night. Today, go back to the room one last time. The lamps have burned low. The reader has been standing for the better part of an hour, and the scroll in his hands is nearly finished. The last lines are small and human. After all the mountains and blood and fire, pray for us. Grace be with you all. Then the reader rolls the scroll closed, and the room is quiet, and history goes dark. We do not know a single name from that gathering. We do not know who sat closest to the reader, or who stood by the door where leaving would have been easy. We do not know which of them steadied, and which of them kept sliding, and which of them lived to see the soldiers come. The honest truth is that the response of that first congregation is lost. No record survives of what happened in their hearts when the scroll closed. But one piece of evidence did survive, and it is worth holding up to the light. The letter itself. Think about what that requires. A document from the 1st century exists today only because a chain of hands refused to let it die. Someone took this scroll, this severe, alarming, 5 times interrupted sermon, and judged it worth keeping. Someone stored it. Someone read it again. Someone copied it by hand, letter by letter, which in the ancient world was slow and expensive, and handed the copy on. And then someone else did the same, generation after generation, through fires and empires and centuries, until it landed in your Bible. We cannot prove who the first keeper was. What we can say is this: whoever first preserved this letter was, by definition, someone who heard the alarms and answered them. You do not spend months copying a warning you have decided to ignore. Somewhere at the beginning of that long chain stands a listener who took the sermon seriously enough to save it. The letter found at least one open ear. Every copy since is the echo of that first yes. And here, the sermon's own argument comes back around and does something remarkable. Remember the case it built from the 95th Psalm. That word today was spoken centuries after the wilderness generation was dust. And the whole point was that the word refused to stay in the past. The door called today was still open in David's time. still open in that Roman room. The invitation, traveling forward through history, always landing in the present tense of whoever heard it. Follow that logic one more step. This sermon was written to be read aloud. It has been read aloud somewhere on earth, in nearly every generation for 20 centuries, and every single time, the word today does what it has always done. It detaches from history and lands on the day it is spoken. The scroll never says yesterday. It cannot. The word was built to find whoever is listening, in whatever room, in whatever century. And to hand them the same open door it handed a tired congregation on a dangerous night. Which means the last listener of the letter nobody signed is always the person hearing it now. So bring back the ship from the beginning, because the ship has one more thing to teach. And it is the reverse of everything the first alarm made us feel. A ship that has begun to drift is not a ship that is lost. Those are two different conditions. Separated by an ocean, drift only wins in the dark, unnoticed, unfelt, uncorrected. The entire power of the current depends on the crew never checking the shoreline. The moment someone looks up, the moment the lights on the coast register as smaller than they were, the current's advantage is gone. And there is one more thing. The quiet fact underneath this whole letter: a man who hears an alarm is, by definition, a man the alarm is still ringing for. The dull ear does not hear the bell. The hardened heart does not ache at the wilderness story. The man who has trampled the treasure does not lie awake wondering about its worth. If the warnings of this letter land on you with any weight at all, that weight is the sound of a voice, still speaking, on the other side of an open door, and the far end of the rope was never in the crew's hands anyway. That was the discovery waiting behind the curtain, in the most restricted room that ever existed. The anchor is already set, carried in by a forerunner, held by a priest who never comes off watch. The letter asks its people to hold fast, and it grounds every command in a stronger grip than theirs. He always lives to intercede. Whatever hour the ship begins to slide, it is never the hour the watchman sleeps. So this is where the 5 alarms of Hebrews finally leave us. A trajectory that is real. Neglect becoming hardness. Hardness becoming dullness. Dullness becoming retreat. Retreat becoming refusal. And a desert with enough graves to prove every stage of it. The warnings are severe because the drift is real. And because the treasure being drifted from upholds the universe. But a warning is not a curse. A warning is mercy wearing a stern face. It means the writer has not given up. It means the voice has not stopped. The letter never asks how you began. It has no interest in the vote you cast years ago at some border you can barely remember. It asks one question, the same question it asked a room full of exhausted believers on a dangerous night in Rome. And it asks it in the only tense the word allows. The scroll has been open for 2,000 years. The reader is still standing, and the oldest song in the book still carries the door inside it. One word wide. Exactly as open as it was at Kadesh Barnea. Exactly as open as it was in Rome. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your heart.